Welcome back, my friend. I'm Elias Grey, your guide for the evening. Tonight, we open a story that glows faintly beneath centuries of dust. A story about light, knowledge, and the strange paths they take once men begin to guard them too closely. It is called The Illuminati, the light that never fades. Before there was a name, before the world had yet whispered Illuminati, there was only a hunger for light. The year was 1776, in a quiet Bavarian town pressed between forests and the murmuring of the Danube. The world outside was changing. Revolution stirred in the air like approaching storms. But in the stone corridors of Ingolstadt University, time still moved with monastic restraint. Inside a candlelit study, a man sat, bent over a clutter of parchment. His name was Adam Weishaupt, a scholar of law, philosophy, and the delicate art of dissent. He was neither priest nor noble, and that, in those days, was almost enough to make him invisible. He had grown under the shadow of the Jesuits, trained in precision, obedience, and thought. Yet, the more he read of Locke and Voltaire, the more he felt a quiet disobedience kindle behind his ribs. The church, he thought, was a lantern turned inward, its flame bright, but trapped behind glass. Why should the few be allowed to interpret light for the many? So on a cool evening in May, with the scent of rain heavy beyond the window panes, he gathered 5 trusted students. They met in a small room, its walls lined with warm books and shadows. One candle on the table, one parchment between them, a circle of trembling faces lit by gold. Upon the parchment, a single phrase written in Latin, Novus Ordo Saeculorum, a new order of the ages. Weishaupt spoke softly, not of rebellion, nor of wealth, nor crowns, but of reason, of a brotherhood of minds unshackled from superstition. He dreamed of enlightenment not as fire, but as dawn, gradual, inevitable, pure. They called themselves the Perfectibilists, for they believed that man could be perfected, morally, intellectually, spiritually, and so began the quietest revolution Europe would never quite forget. Nights in Ingolstadt lengthened. The brothers, for so they called one another, met in secret under the cover of study and prayer. Each was bound by oath, not of blood, but of purpose. They adopted symbols, the owl of Minerva for wisdom, the pyramid for endurance. They used ciphers and code names. Weishaupt himself was known simply as Spartacus. In their small gatherings, they spoke of a world reordered by knowledge. No kings, no priests. Only the illumination of truth shared freely among all. But idealism, like light, attracts both seekers and moths. As the order grew, so too did its temptations, the desire to guide, to control, to reshape. Some members whispered of influence, of using power to steer governments toward reason. Others urged restraint, fearing that secrecy would turn the dream inward upon itself. And Weishaupt, for all his brilliance, began to believe that enlightenment required guardians, men of clarity who could shepherd humanity toward light. He told himself it was for their own good. He told himself that truth must sometimes be hidden until the world is ready to receive it. In that subtle turn of thought, a shadow entered the light. Across Europe, change was stirring. In Paris, salons hummed with ideas of liberty. In London, philosophers wrote of rights and conscience. And in the forests of Bavaria, a handful of men met by candlelight, convinced they were shaping the future. The Illuminati, as they now called themselves, began to weave their quiet network through universities and courts, through libraries and lodges. They borrowed rituals from the Freemasons, blending reason with ceremony, thought with symbol. Every oath was a mirror of ancient mystery, to seek truth, to protect it, to never betray the brotherhood. And yet, beneath their noble phrases, a new rhythm emerged, one of hierarchy, secrecy, obedience. The very structures they sought to dissolve had found new life within them. Weishaupt felt it too. He wrote endlessly, letters, essays, rules for the order. His hand shook sometimes, as if the ink itself carried doubt. He wanted light to guide men, not govern them. But already, the organization had begun to breathe on its own. A creature of secrecy, feeding on conviction. One night, when the candles burned low and the last student had gone, Weishaupt sat alone in his study. The room smelled of smoke and damp parchment. Outside, the bells of Ingolstadt tolled midnight. He looked at the single candle before him and thought, if knowledge is light, then who among us is pure enough to hold it? The flame flickered. He smiled faintly and whispered, perhaps no one. The candle guttered out. And so, in the small hours of Bavaria, the dream of illumination was kindled, not in rebellion, but in longing. A handful of minds believing they could outshine the dark. But every light, no matter how bright, casts its own shadow. In our next chapter, we follow the secret paths that light took, into lodges, into courts, into the quiet machinery of influence. The flame that was born in Ingolstadt did not remain alone for long. Like all light, it searched for mirrors. When dawn touched Bavaria that summer of 1777, the forest glistened with dew. In the city, smoke rose softly from chimneys. Bells tolled for morning prayer. And the young professors of the university went about their lectures as if nothing unseen moved among them. But beneath the calm, a network of minds had begun to stir. Letters passed quietly between hands, folded, sealed with wax. Some bore only a symbol, an owl, its wings outstretched across a rising sun. Others contained codes that spoke of meeting places, passwords, and vows. By autumn, the order of the Illuminati had already spread beyond Ingolstadt. Students carried its whispers to Munich, Augsburg, Vienna, and from there into the salons and Masonic lodges of Europe's restless Enlightenment. The brotherhood grew in silence, like roots beneath a forest floor. And though their numbers remained few, their ambition was boundless. They called themselves the wise, the seekers, the enlightened. Each new initiate swore to abandon selfish interest and serve only the cause of reason. Each swore to obey his superior as though obeying the ideal of truth itself. And so the chain began, link by link, oath by oath, until it circled back upon itself in a perfect ring. By night, meetings were held in candlelit chambers, veiled behind curtains and silence. They wore no crowns, no medals, only rings engraved with symbols, the radiant triangle, the unfinished pyramid, the all-seeing eye. Each gesture, each word carried double meaning. In one such meeting, a newly initiated scholar recalled his oath. I swear eternal fidelity to the cause of enlightenment, to conceal its secrets and to labor for the perfection of mankind. The words sounded pure, almost sacred, but purity, when bound in secrecy, begins to bend. Weishaupt's idea had been to free knowledge from authority. Yet as the order expanded, authority returned in another form. Ranks, hierarchies, hidden masters. Each member knew only the one above him, never the whole design. Thus, they built a pyramid of minds, each convinced he was serving reason, while reason itself became a distant star, faint and unreachable. Still, there was beauty in their gatherings, in the smell of old books and candle wax, in the quiet devotion to learning. They studied mathematics, philosophy, the natural sciences, and the moral writings of antiquity. They believed that through study, through discipline, the soul might ascend toward illumination, not by grace, but by will. Outside, the world was waking into modernity, machines beginning to hum, nations stirring, revolutions whispering of freedom. The Illuminati believed they stood at the heart of this transformation, unseen but guiding. But power, even imagined power, has its gravity. It draws both the noble and the ambitious. Among those drawn to the order was a man named Adolf Freiherr Knigge, a nobleman of wit and reputation, a mason with a mind like polished steel. When he met Weishaupt, he saw both a philosopher and a tactician. He admired the ideal, but he also saw its potential. How such an order might shape kingdoms, influence policy, perhaps even birth a new society. He joined eagerly and soon after began to restructure the Brotherhood. It was Knigge who brought the order into the Masonic lodges of Germany, where secrecy was an art and ritual a language. There, under vaulted ceilings and the faint scent of incense, the two societies began to intertwine. Through Knigge's charm, dukes and barons entered the fold. Through Weishaupt's conviction, scholars and students followed, and together they imagined a Europe reborn, one that would no longer bow to superstition or crown, but to wisdom itself. It was, in its purest sense, a dream of light. But as always, the brighter the flame, the darker the edges around it. In those candlelit meetings, the air was thick with idealism, but beneath it ran another current, unspoken, electric. Power was now within reach if only they could remain unseen, if only the church, the state, the people never found out. So secrecy deepened. They began to speak in symbols alone, to write letters in cipher, to conceal meaning behind allegory. A simple triangle on a document could signify a chain of influence. An owl inked in a margin could signal initiation. Each man felt himself part of something vast and noble, and yet no one saw its total shape. It was said that Weishaupt began to dream of influencing princes, that he imagined placing wise men within the courts of Europe, guiding policy from the shadows, not to dominate, but to enlighten. At least, that is what he told himself. But the line between guidance and control is thinner than candle smoke. Late one evening, Knigge and Weishaupt sat together in a small inn, the hour well past midnight. A single candle burned between them, its light trembling in their cups of dark wine. Knigge leaned forward. "We can do more than teach," he said softly. "We can steer." Weishaupt looked down at the flame. "To steer is to command," he murmured. "And command corrupts even the wise." Knigge smiled faintly. "Then let us be wiser." The candle flared, as if in reply. Outside, the world went on unaware. But within those lodges and universities, a quiet machinery turned, invisible gears of loyalty, ambition, and belief. Some saw the order as salvation, others as manipulation draped in philosophy. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between. Light, after all, both reveals and blinds. By the year 1784, the order's roots had spread across the German states. But every hidden garden grows under watchful eyes, and soon the light that sought to remain unseen would catch the attention of the world. Next, we'll step into Chapter 3, The Shadow of the Crown, where the secret meets suspicion and light begins to tremble under scrutiny. Light cannot hide forever. Even the gentlest flame, if it burns long enough, is seen. By the early 1780s, Bavaria had begun to murmur. There were rumours in taverns and whispers in churches, of secret gatherings, of men who spoke of enlightenment and brotherhood, of codes and vows uttered under candlelight. To the ordinary townsman, it was only gossip. But to the Elector of Bavaria, it was a warning. The air of Europe was restless. Kings and bishops watched the growing tide of reason with unease. Pamphlets flowed like rivers through the cities. Words of liberty, reform, the equality of men. And somewhere amid this swelling chorus, the name Illuminati began to surface. It was said these men sought to guide governments, that they had infiltrated the Freemasons, that they aimed not merely to enlighten, but to overturn the order of the world. Of course, rumour always grows faster than truth. The Illuminati's meetings were small, their influence subtle. Yet secrecy invites imagination, and imagination, once roused, becomes its own kind of light, flickering, dangerous, unstoppable. In Munich, a priest named Franz Xaver Zwack, once a loyal member of the order, had begun to drift from Weishaupt's ideals. He possessed letters, plans, and rituals, enough to give shape to the shadow that had begun to trouble the state. And when his loyalty wavered, so did the order's silence. The authorities soon raided his home. What they found would ignite the fears of Europe. Documents sealed with the order's symbol, manuscripts describing initiation rites, secret correspondences, even discussions of influencing princes. There was talk of reason above religion, of a universal morality untethered from the church. For men already fearful of revolution, it was enough to see darkness where only thought had dwelt. In the spring of 1784, the Elector of Bavaria issued a decree banning all secret societies. By 1785, the Illuminati were officially outlawed. The dream of a brotherhood of reason was declared a crime against crown and cross. Ingolstadt fell silent. Meetings ceased, candles were extinguished, and letters burned in hearths throughout Bavaria. Weishaupt fled into exile, moving from one refuge to another, a scholar without a home. He carried with him little more than his papers and the faint conviction that light, though banished, could never truly die. Imagine him, a man once revered, now a fugitive beneath foreign stars. He travelled through Saxony and Prussia, staying in borrowed rooms, always writing. He wrote to defend his vision, that enlightenment should unite humanity, not divide it. That secrecy was never meant for power, only for protection. Yet history rarely listens to the letters of the defeated. His words would not soothe the fear that had already taken root, the fear of invisible hands shaping nations, of unseen powers whispering in the ears of kings. And so, the legend of the Illuminati began not with their power, but with their persecution. It is one of history's gentle ironies that ideas grow strongest when forbidden. The order that once numbered only a few hundred men became, through suppression, immortal in imagination. Across Europe, pamphlets began to speak of a hidden fraternity still operating in silence. Some claimed its members had fled to France, others to America. The notion of a secret brotherhood surviving extinction became, itself, a kind of myth. And yet, behind the myth, one truth lingered: the corruption of idealism. What began as an act of faith in human reason had turned into a mirror for human fear. Light, once meant to free, had been hidden, distorted, and finally condemned. One evening, years later, a traveller in Gotha recorded seeing Weishaupt in the corner of a small inn. The man was older now, his once bright eyes dimmed by time. Before him lay an open book, its margins filled with careful notes. When the innkeeper asked what he studied, Weishaupt smiled faintly and said, "Only the way of the light, the one men forget once they begin to fear its warmth." The innkeeper, not understanding, left him to his silence. But perhaps, in that moment, Weishaupt knew what few men ever do, that every light creates its own shadow, and that both are eternal. Elias Grey. And so, the Illuminati was said to vanish. But shadows rarely disappear. They only change their shape. In our next chapter, we follow the echoes, across borders, across revolutions. As the name Illuminati drifts like smoke into the age of reason and rebellion. And so, the Illuminati were said to vanish. But shadows rarely disappear, they only change their shape. In our next chapter, we follow the echoes, across borders, across revolutions, as the name Illuminati drifts like smoke into the age of reason and rebellion. It is the year 1789. Across the Rhine, the bells of Paris toll not for vespers, but for change. The air tastes of smoke and iron, and the streets tremble with the footsteps of a people newly awake. In taverns and salons, words once whispered in secrecy now ring aloud. Liberty, equality, reason. The dream that Adam Weishaupt had kindled in obscurity seems, for a moment, to blaze across nations. Philosophers write as though the age of light has at last arrived. Priests are questioned, kings unsettled, and even the heavens seem closer to human reach. Yet, in the corners of every debate, a shadow begins to form, a question whispered by those who fear what freedom might cost. Who lit this fire? Pamphleteers and priests alike begin to speak of a hidden hand guiding the revolution, an order of philosophers who, years before, had sworn to overturn thrones and altars alike. The name returns from exile, Illuminati. To some, it is legend, to others, a warning, and to many, it becomes the simplest answer to the chaos of their age. Across Europe, conspiracy becomes a comfort. It is easier to believe that men are guided by secret masters than to face the wild truth. That humanity, once unbound, may not know what to do with its own freedom. In London, a writer named John Robison begins to gather tales of the vanished order. He is a professor, sober-minded, yet uneasy, about the fever of revolution spreading through France. His book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, published in 1797, claims that the Illuminati lives still, that their invisible hand stirs the clubs of Paris, the Jacobins, the guillotines. In the same year, across the Atlantic, a clergyman named Abbé Baruel pens his own account, weaving the Freemasons, the philosophers, and the Illuminati into a single grand design. To him, the age of reason is not salvation, but seduction, the devil's light disguised as wisdom. Their works spread like embers on the wind. Princes read them, commoners whisper them, and soon the very word Illuminati glows with unease. It is strange, is it not, that an idea so small, born in the stillness of a scholar's room, should become the ghost haunting the conscience of an age. In truth, Weishaupt's order had been silent for years. Its letters were scattered, its members disbanded, its founder in quiet exile. But myth has no need of proof. A myth only needs desire and fear. And so, through the smoke of revolution, the legend found its second life. In Paris, where torches lined the streets and the river glowed with reflections of fire, one could imagine those early ideals returning in a new disguise. Men in assembly halls spoke of the rights of man, of reason's triumph over tyranny, of the dawn that would never fade. Yet the guillotine's blade fell in rhythm with their words. Light and darkness, now inseparable, danced together in the square. Perhaps it were not the Illuminati that had survived, but something older. The eternal tension between knowledge and mercy, between vision and restraint. The human heart, once convinced of its righteousness, can become the sharpest instrument of night. Far from the noise of Paris, in a quiet house in Gotha, Weishaupt sat beneath the same sky and listened to the storm of history. He was older now, and his letters spoke less of brotherhood, more of reflection. He wrote, "Men wish to be free, yet fear to be responsible for themselves. They build chains of gold and call them order." He did not know that his words would one day echo beneath countless banners, that long after his bones had turned to dust, people would still speak of the light he sought to kindle and the shadow it cast across centuries. By the dawn of the 1800s, Europe was weary. The fires of revolution had cooled to smoke, and the new century arrived draped in caution. But the story of the Illuminati, now half legend, half accusation, would not rest. The secret society had become a mirror, each generation seeing within it whatever it most feared or desired. To kings, it was rebellion. To reformers, inspiration. To dreamers, proof that light could survive suppression. And so, the myth endured, quiet as dust, patient as time. In every century, a whisper remains, that somewhere, behind the curtains of power, there are still those who meet by candlelight, still those who believe the mind can redeem the world. In our next chapter, we follow that whisper into the 19th century, into libraries and secret lodges, where the memory of the Illuminati begins to shape a new kind of faith, the belief in the unseen order of history itself. Every vanished thing leaves an echo. Sometimes that echo grows louder than the thing itself. The 19th century opened not with revolution, but with reflection. Europe exhaled, exhausted, scarred, and yet restless beneath its new order. Empires redrew their borders. Kings reclaimed their thrones. And in the quiet between wars, a subtler battle began, a struggle for the soul of knowledge itself. Libraries filled with the writings of those who had dreamed of reason's triumph. Yet, amid the pages of philosophy and science, there ran a quieter current, a fascination with the unseen. Mesmerists, alchemists, mystics, all claimed to trace their wisdom back to forgotten brotherhoods of light. And somewhere in that shimmering constellation of secrecy, the name Illuminati glowed faintly once more, not as a threat, but as an inheritance. In Germany, the Romantic poets wrote of lost ages and hidden knowledge. In France, secret lodges gathered again. No longer political, but spiritual. They spoke not of revolution, but of revelation, of divine geometry, sacred light, and the idea that truth could be felt as much as reasoned. Some even whispered that the Illuminati had not died, but had merely changed form. Trade in politics for philosophy, conspiracy for contemplation. Whether true or not, the idea itself had power. to believe that there existed an unbroken chain of wisdom, stretching from the temples of Egypt to the candlelit rooms of Bavaria, was to believe that knowledge, though persecuted, was immortal. And perhaps that belief was comfort enough for a century seeking balance between science and soul. In London, societies of inquiry began to flourish. The Rosicrucians, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Theosophists of Helena Blavatsky. Each, in its own way, echoed the old dream that enlightenment could transform not just nations, but the self. It was said in hushed tones that among their founders were men and women who still used symbols drawn from Weishaupt's vanished order: the pyramid, the eye, the radiant dawn. Some claimed it was imitation, others inheritance. But the invisible thread held fast, tying the rational to the mystical, the candle flame to the star. In these gatherings, the corruption of idealism took a new shape. Where Weishaupt had once sought to perfect mankind through knowledge, these new seekers dreamed of perfection through initiation. The light became a mystery again, guarded, veiled, reserved for the few. They studied the hidden meanings of numbers, the secret languages of symbols, and the unseen harmonies of the cosmos. Each layer of secrecy promised the next. Each revelation hinted at something deeper still. And so, once more, the flame was placed behind glass, its warmth belonging only to those who had earned it. There is a kind of irony here. One history seems to love repeating. Knowledge, born in the open air of curiosity, inevitably retreats into the guarded chambers of power. Light, which seeks only to illuminate, becomes currency. Perhaps this is why the idea of the Illuminati never dies. It represents not a single brotherhood, but the eternal temptation to hold wisdom as possession. To say, we know, while others are left in the dark. And yet, not all was shadow. For even within these secret orders, there were those who sought only the poetry of truth, the beauty of pattern, the calm of understanding. They spoke softly of unity, of the divine spark within all minds. And in the candle-lit hush of their rituals, one might almost hear the faint echo of Weishaupt's first oath: to seek light and to share it. By the mid-19th century, the legend of the Illuminati had become part of Europe's imagination. It appeared in novels, in caricatures, in whispered rumours at the edge of salons. Artists painted them as robe mystics. Politicians used the name as accusation. The word Illuminati became a mirror, its reflection shaped by whoever gazed upon it. To the devout, it was a symbol of arrogance. To the skeptic, a parable of lost ideals. And to the dreamer, it was proof that somewhere, someone, still believed that knowledge could redeem the world. The candlelight of the past had not gone out. It had scattered into art, into science, into the tender hands of poets. And though no brotherhood now claimed the name, the idea of illumination lived quietly in the hearts of those who still read by moonlight, still questioned the patterns of the world, and still believed that thought itself could be sacred. The century turned, and with it, the story changed again. For every age invents its own shadows. As the world moved toward industry and empire, the quiet myth of the Illuminati began to stir in darker corners, in politics, in paranoia, and in the uneasy marriage of progress and fear. In our next chapter, we enter the industrial age, where light becomes electricity and secrecy becomes machinery, where humanity's newfound brilliance begins to wonder who, if anyone, holds the switch. Every dawn brings a new kind of light, but the question remains, who tends it and who is seen by it? The world at the turn of the 20th century gleamed with invention. The streets of London and Paris blazed with gaslight. Soon electric lamps would mimic the stars. Steam trains sang across continents. The telegraph carried words faster than wind, and the human voice began to hum inside thin coils of wire. Humanity, it seemed, had mastered illumination itself. But with light came surveillance, and with surveillance, a new kind of secrecy. In this metallic glow, the word Illuminati was spoken again, no longer as myth or philosophy, but as suspicion, a name for whatever unseen powers guided the expanding world. Factories rose where forests had been. Nations, now bound by wires and wealth, grew uneasy in their new closeness. Empires feared invisible alliances. Citizens feared invisible rulers. The old fear of hidden knowledge, once confined to monasteries and lodges, now seeped into newspapers and coffeehouse whispers. It was said that secret councils met not in candlelight, but in boardrooms, that fortunes, not rituals, were the new symbols of initiation. And yet, beneath these worldly suspicions, the same old story pulsed quietly on, the longing to understand who commands the light. Writers of the age turned the myth into metaphor. H.G. Wells, in his visions of the future, spoke of a world directed by a new aristocracy of the intellect. Kipling, Chesterton, Conrad, each in their way, imagined societies hidden beneath the surface of empire. In their pages, the Illuminati became a shadow cast by progress itself, a symbol of the cost of enlightenment when it belongs only to the few. Meanwhile, real societies still met quietly. The Society for Psychical Research, the Golden Dawn, circles of mystics who spoke now of vibrations and energies rather than angels. Light had become both science and sacrament, and still, in the half-lit corners of laboratories and libraries, a few remembered the old motto, Novus Ordo Secularum. They whispered it not as rebellion, but as reverence, for the belief that understanding might yet redeem the world. But progress, like power, gathers its own momentum. The same wires that carried voices would soon carry commands. The same machines that printed poems would one day print propaganda. And so, the dream of illumination began to twist again. From revelation into control. Governments built ministries of information. Corporations learned to measure desire. The light that once freed men to think now exposed them to being known. Even knowledge, it seemed, could cast too harsh a glow. Somewhere in Berlin, a scholar leafed through an old copy of Roberson's Proofs of a Conspiracy. He smiled at its paranoia, yet lingered on a single phrase. The enlightened will ever seek to direct the darkness. He wrote in the margin, in careful ink. Perhaps the darkness is only our reflection. That note would never be published, but it might have pleased Weishaupt to know that even a century later, one reader still sensed the tenderness in the myth. Not fear, but longing. As the century moved toward its wars, the myth of the Illuminati began to fuse with politics. Each empire accused another of secret control. Each revolution claimed to expose hidden masters. The idea of the unseen order had become the language of modern anxiety. And yet, beneath the suspicion, there lingered a trace of reverence, a quiet admission that perhaps the world's complexity was too vast for chance alone. Perhaps somewhere, someone must be keeping watch. And maybe that is the secret heart of every conspiracy. The wish that someone, anyone, understands the pattern that we ourselves cannot. For to believe in the unseen hand is also to believe in meaning. And meaning, like light, is something we cannot bear to imagine extinguished. The 20th century would soon burst into flame. Wars of industry, of ideology, of light turn to fire. And in those years of thunder, the name Illuminati would surface once more. No longer as myth, but as mirror. In our next chapter, we step into the storm itself. The age of propaganda, secrecy, and the strange rebirth of ancient fears. Some stories do not fade with time. They change their language from parchment to paper, from whisper to broadcast. And in the noise of a modern world, the old symbols still gleam, faint and persistent, like embers in rain. The 20th century dawned, and the world forgot how to sleep. Cities glowed through the night, factories breathed smoke into the stars, and the rhythm of machines replaced the hush of prayer. Men no longer gathered by candlelight to seek truth. They gathered under floodlights to build it. Yet the same ancient hunger remained, to understand who holds the flame, and why its warmth feels so often like power. As the Great War consumed Europe, the dream of reason was shattered once more. Empires that had sung hymns to progress found themselves lost in the machinery of destruction. When the silence finally returned in 1918, the world looked into the mirror of its own creation and saw only smoke. Out of that smoke rose new movements, new ideologies, each claiming to carry the light of renewal, nationalism, communism, fascism. Each promised illumination, each demanded devotion. And behind every promise, people began to hear again the whisper of the unseen. If the world was ruled by reason, why did reason lead so easily to ruin? Books returned to the idea of hidden orders. Pamphlets, both sincere and venomous, spoke again of secret brotherhoods guiding governments, manipulating markets, or designing the very wars that tore the earth apart. The Illuminati, long buried beneath romantic myth, became once more the name given to the fear of invisible control. In Germany, where defeat bred desperation, propagandists reworked old legends of conspiracies. They replaced enlightened ones with darker imaginings, twisting a story once about knowledge into one of blame. The light became accusation. The word Illuminati was spoken again, but now it carried the weight of persecution. And so an idea born of reason was used to ignite hatred, proof that even myths of light can be turned into fire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the early American century turned the story into something stranger, a folklore of freedom and suspicion. In smoky bars and radio programs, people whispered that unseen forces steered presidents, that bankers and scholars shared a single secret oath. Every unexplained turn of politics seemed to need its hidden author. The word Illuminati became shorthand for unease, for the quiet feeling that progress moved faster than conscience. And yet, there was poetry, even in the paranoia. For behind every accusation, there lingered a wish that somewhere intelligence still governed chaos. That light, however distant, still guided the storm. In those years, new kinds of watchers emerged. Cameras replaced sentinels. Radio waves carried both truth and deceit. Governments gathered secrets as if hoarding treasure. To live in the 20th century was to live within networks unseen. And as men learned to fear what they could not see, they began to believe again in the oldest myth of all, that knowledge, when hidden, becomes absolute. But perhaps, if one looked closer, the Illuminati never truly vanished, nor returned. They had simply changed their shape as every generation's conscience changes shape, from scholars with candles to clerks with typewriters, from secret lodges to quiet rooms filled with data and light. There is a moment in every century when humanity looks upon its own reflection and cannot tell whether it is progress it sees or power. The mirror does not lie, but it does not explain. And so the myth of the Illuminati endures not as doctrine, but as reflection. A story we tell when we no longer trust the brightness we've built. In the decades to come, the world would burn again. Light itself would be weaponized, from searchlights over cities to the white flash of atomic dawn. And in that blinding brilliance, humanity would once more ask the same quiet question: who keeps the flame? In our next chapter, we step into the Cold War, where secrecy became an empire of its own, and the old idea of illumination took on the glow of screens and stars. The 20th century learned to make its own sun, and when day could be summoned at will, night became something we carried inside. The year is 1945. Cities lie in ashes, and over a desert in New Mexico, a man-made dawn blooms brighter than any morning. The air trembles. The dust lifts. For a heartbeat, the world forgets what darkness means. From that moment forward, illumination would never again be innocent. Light became strategy, light became weapon, and secrecy, now global, learned to wear the face of science. Across the oceans, the new powers divided the planet like a chessboard of fear. Wires stretched under seas, satellites blinked above clouds, and in sealed rooms filled with tape reels and static. Men watched other men from behind screens of flickering green. They called it intelligence. But it was something older than that. The ancient wish to see without being seen. To the ordinary citizen, progress shimmered. Television, jet engines, the promise of peace through technology. Yet behind every invention, another story coiled in shadow, of files, of codes, of invisible eyes. The new world was flooded with light, but the heart of that light was cold. Rumors multiplied as easily as radio waves. Every new marvel seemed to demand its secret master. When rockets climbed beyond the atmosphere, people whispered that someone must already know what waited among the stars. When nations spoke of freedom, others heard only orchestration. The word Illuminati drifted back into conversation. No longer a name for philosophers, but for those imagined to stand behind governments, directing the theatre of the Cold War. Writers filled pages with speculation that think tanks were temples, that intelligence agencies were the new lodges of power. In truth, most were only bureaucracies of frightened men. But fear itself is an architect. It builds invisible cathedrals in the mind. And so, from whispers and coincidence, a modern mythology took shape. A story of circles within circles, of meetings in smoke-filled rooms, where light never quite reached the floor. People needed to believe that someone, somewhere, understood the pattern. It was easier than accepting that the pattern might not exist. In the suburbs of the New Age, children lay on living room carpets, watching test patterns glow across television screens. They did not know that the same signal that brought laughter and music into their homes also carried the echo of propaganda. Even comfort now was curated light. The Illuminati of this era were not monks or masons. They were engineers, advertisers, analysts, people who turned information into influence. And if they existed only as metaphor, the metaphor was powerful enough to steer imagination itself. Meanwhile, real seekers still gathered quietly, philosophers, scientists, poets, trying to rescue wonder from utility. They spoke again of unity, of the small flame within every conscious being. Some quoted Weishaupt without knowing his name. They believed that reason, if made humble, could yet be holy. But humility is rarely newsworthy. And so the world listened instead to the louder story, the one of plots and masters and unseen empires. As the century advanced, the globe shimmered with new constellations of light. City grids seen from orbit, data centers humming like beehives, the quiet pulse of machines learning to think. And still, the same question burned behind it all. Is someone watching the watchers, or is the light itself watching us? The Cold War ended, they say. But light, once weaponized, cannot easily be returned to warmth. And so, as we stepped into the age of computers and satellites, the myth of the Illuminati entered a new vessel, the vast, glowing network of the modern world. In our next chapter, we drift into that network, into pixels and passwords, where the old hunger for illumination becomes the dream of connection, and secrecy wears the smile of progress. When light entered the wire, it stopped being gentle. It became instant, everywhere, impossible to turn away from. And in its brilliance, we found a new kind of shadow. At the dawn of the 21st century, the planet glowed from orbit, a single, webbed lantern against the dark. Every city shimmered like a circuit. Every home, a small pulsing node. The dream of connection, long whispered in candlelit chambers, had at last come true. Information flowed without gate or guard. Knowledge, once the secret currency of brotherhoods, was now a river anyone could step into. And yet, as the world filled with voices, a strange quiet returned. The hush of being watched, the sense that invisibility had simply changed sides. People began to speak again of hidden powers, not of kings nor priests, but of algorithms and unseen curators of light. Search engines replaced oracles, data replaced prophecy. We no longer asked who holds the candle, but who programs the bulb. Every pattern discovered was soon doubted, every freedom granted shadowed by surveillance. And through the threads of this vast new web, the word Illuminati returned, not as accusation, not as proof, but as symbol of the oldest unease, that the more connected we become, the less we know who listens. The myth adapted easily. In digital forums and glowing screens, new stories sprouted like moss after rain, secret councils behind governments, musicians marked by hidden symbols, corporations whispering in code, most of it fantasy. But fantasy, once shared by millions, becomes a kind of faith. It filled the same need that Weishaupt's circle once sought to answer, the need to believe that knowledge still meant something sacred, that there was order beneath the flood of noise. In this new age, illumination meant exposure. The light no longer warmed, It revealed. The world had become its own candle, and we, its endless reflections. Yet, in quieter corners of the web, there were those who reached not for fear, but for wonder. Artists and thinkers tracing connections between stars and circuits, between myth and memory. They called their work open source mysticism, a digital brotherhood without hierarchy, where the only initiation was curiosity. It was Weishaupt's dream, inverted, light not hoarded but shared, knowledge not guarded but given. For a brief moment, it seemed that humanity might reclaim the gentler meaning of illumination. But even that light was fragile. Truth, when multiplied too quickly, can scatter like sparks in the wind. And soon, the same networks that connected us also divided us. Each screen a mirror of private certainties. The old corruption of idealism returned, now wrapped in code and color. The dream of a unified mind became a marketplace of echoing selves. Still, amid the noise, there were moments of grace. A child learning across oceans. A voice heard where silence once ruled. A poem translated instantly into 100 tongues. Light, for all its coldness, could still heal. And in those fleeting harmonies, one might sense the distant echo of the first vow. To seek light, and to share it. Perhaps the Illuminati never vanished, because it was never only a group of men, but a reflection of our own dual longing, to know and to be known, to understand and to remain mysterious. In the network's glow, humanity became its own order of illumination. Billions of tiny sparks, each both observer and observed. And if that sounds like prophecy, remember that prophecy is merely history, repeated softly enough to sound new. The light no longer flickers, it hums. The old candles are gone, but their reflections linger in our screens and skies. And now, standing at the edge of the modern world, we must ask what every age has asked before. When knowledge touches everything, what remains sacred? In our final chapter, we return to where the story began, to the small, trembling flame in a quiet Bavarian room, and to the question that still waits, patient and unresolved. Every story returns to its beginning, just as every flame carries the memory of the spark that birthed it. The night is quiet again. We are far from the hum of wires, the glow of cities, the noise of progress. The world, for a moment, seems to breathe like it once did. Slow, rhythmic, alive. Before us, a small wooden table. On it, a single candle. Its flame leans slightly, stirred by an unseen breath. And somewhere in that silence, we might imagine Adam Weishaupt still seated, ink-stained fingers resting on parchment, the air heavy with thought and hope. He does not know what the centuries will make of his dream. He does not yet imagine that his quiet act of rebellion, the gathering of 5 minds beneath one trembling light, will echo through revolutions, through wars, through the endless corridors of rumour. He knows only this, that to learn is holy, and to share learning is divine. It is a belief both dangerous and pure. Dangerous, because the world mistakes light for power. Pure, because light itself never judges who receives it. If Weishaupt were here now, if we could speak across the centuries, perhaps we would tell him that his order was not lost, only transformed. That his vision, stripped of secrecy, lives on in every library, every child with a question, every hand that reaches for understanding instead of control. Perhaps he would smile quietly, or perhaps he would shake his head, seeing how easily knowledge becomes vanity, how swiftly illumination blinds. But even so, even knowing all that has followed, he might still light the candle, because some gestures are worth repeating, no matter how many times they're misunderstood. Centuries have passed since that night in Ingolstadt, yet the same small drama continues. Someone, somewhere, kindles a flame against the dark, believing that thought can save us. And every time that happens, a little of the old dream returns, not the conspiracy, not the secrecy, but the faith that light, however fragile, is still the gentlest form of resistance. For all the myths that cling to the name Illuminati, its truest legacy may be nothing more and nothing less than this: a reminder that knowledge, once shared, is already freedom. We stand now in an age where every soul holds a lantern, each screen, each mind, a tiny window of light against the vastness of the unknown. And though we may never find the keepers of the first flame, we carry its reflection in our questions, in our doubts, in our quiet wish to see clearly and to be seen gently in return. Light does not fade. It changes form. It moves from fire to filament, from filament to fiber, from page to pixel, and from one heart to another. Even when it blinds us, it teaches. Even when it is hidden, it waits. Perhaps that is the secret Weishaupt meant all along. Not a brotherhood of men, but a brotherhood of moments, each of us, in our own time, learning how to bear the weight of knowing. And so, my friend, the story ends where it began, with a single light burning quietly in the dark, reminding us that understanding, when kept humble, is still the oldest form of love. May we guard it not as treasure, but as warmth. May we share it and let it pass on until someone, long after us, finds its glow and calls it new. Thank you for listening. May your dreams be gentle and your curiosity endless. Good night.